Hello, guys and gals, and this is our part 10. Okay, part 10 of our reading of A Natural History of Dragons, a memoir by Lady Trent, a book by Marie Brennan, and we're going to go over the copyright information as always. You find it in the physical book. You'll be seeing it on the screen right there. It says Natural History of Dragons is copyright 2013 by Bryn Noonschwander. All rights reserved. The interior illustrations are by Todd Lockwood. The maps are by Rhys Davies. And the design is by Greg Collins. Anyways. In the last book, the last chapter, I think we read all of chapter 8 last time. That's pretty good. I really like getting a chapter off at a time. So, anyways, in the last part of our reading, Lady Trent, I'm going to call her Lady Trent. Her name is technically Isabel Camhurst currently, but we'll call her Lady Trent. In the last one, they were still not sure where Gretelkin was, who was supposed to be their local guy. And they're trying to find a way to search for dragons. They're mapping the countryside. The men are, anyways, while Lady Trent stays at home. And she apparently found a way to finally help them. And we're going to find out what that is. And we are to chapter 9. A shadow in the night. A foolish response. I don't know how to say this, but it's like Stollerens in the mountains and the possibility of aid. Okay. There is, let me go back to this. Okay. There is a peculiarity that comes from living in a rural village, with which my readers, most of whom I imagine enjoy the benefit of the electrical lights and that are nowadays everywhere, may be unfamiliar. In the absence of artificial illumination, one's sleep divides into two distinct periods, with a gap of wakefulness during the dark hours of the night. Experiencing this in Drusenev, I initially attributed it to the lumpiness of the bed, the cold of the room, the general alienness of my surroundings, and so on. It took me some time to discover this was the usual way of things for the villagers. Jacob's own habits took longer to shift, I think because of the strenuous exercise he received climbing about the mountains. On the night I will now relate to you, I had not yet learned the reason for my wakefulness. All I knew was that I awoke, as I had for several nights running, and could not immediately go back to sleep. Rather than trouble Jacob with my tossing and turning, I rose from the bed, wrapped myself in a thick robe, and tiptoed out to occupy myself elsewhere until drowsiness returned. It's an odd time, that period of midnight wakefulness, if you are not accustomed to it. The world seems dreamlike at that hour, and the mind subsides into a meditative state. My own thoughts seem distant to me, like specimens upon the table of my shed back home. I considered reading as I had the previous 2 nights, but felt guilty at using yet more candles, especially as I was beginning to suspect that striking a light only postponed my return to sleep. I went into our workroom, it being the place I was least likely to disturb anyone, but instead of reading, I unbarred the shutters and swung them open. Chill air struck my face, simultaneously bringing me further awake and yet strengthening the dreamlike nature of my thoughts. I felt pleasantly detached from myself, and sitting in the dark room gave myself over to contemplation of the cloudless night sky. I pray you forgive me if I temporarily postpone the true purpose of this narration, to speak about about that sky. In Falchester at that time, and in most places, and many places these days, the light from human habitation blots out a portion of the stars. And, you might ask, wondering why this matters, there is still plenty of stars to be seen, but I remember my childhood home in Tamshire, far enough from the nearest city to be spared this change, and I remember the sky above the mountains of Vestrana. You may think you see plenty of stars, friend reader, but you are wrong. Night is both blacker and more brilliant than you can imagine, and the sky a glory that puts to shame the most splendid jewels at Renwick's. Up in the mountains, where the air is crisper than the humid atmosphere of Skirland, I beheld a beauty I had never before seen. I am not often a sentimental woman, but whether it was the splendor above me or my old state of mind, likely both, my odd state of mind, or both, I found myself nearly overwhelmed. At first I was entranced, then feeling it was too much, I tore my eyes away and contemplated the far more mundane scene of sleeping Drustanev. Mundane, except for the light that flared some distance away. That was not the diamond wink of a star, but the warm spilling glow of firelight. A door had opened in one of the houses, and two figures appeared in the gap. One smaller had the rounded silhouette of a woman with a shawl thrown over her shoulders. The other was noticeably taller, with clothing in an unfamiliar style, and in the light from inside I saw something even more out of place. Yellow hair pulled back into a very un-Vestrani plait. The fascination of the stars fled as I sat up, peering through the darkness toward those two. My first absurd thought was that Mr. Wilker had taken a Drustanev woman for his lover. For lovers, those two certainly were, but the way they embraced in the doorway, the man appeared as reluctant to depart as the woman was to let him go. But Mr. Wilker's hair was not so light, nor nearly long enough to braid. The man was no one I had seen in the village, and there were not so many people in Drustanev that I could have overlooked that blonde head among them. I became aware that I was now hanging halfway out the window, its sill pressing uncomfortably across my pelvis, as if closing the distance by 2 feet would allow me to make out more detail. My interest was not prurient. In fact, I wished the two would stop kissing and move apart so I could see the man's face. But the face was not what mattered, was it? His features would not tell me who he was. I hauled myself back inside, stuffed my feet into the muddy shoes I had left by the door, and slipped outside without a sound. I would like to tell you that I did this because of the dreamlike state brought on by walking in the middle of the night. It is a fine excuse, and there might be some truth to it. The bulk of the blame, however, must fall upon my impatience, which chafed under the slowness of our research, and second upon my curiosity, which knew even fewer bounds than usual that night. By the time I made it outside, the door had closed. I halted, clutching up my robe so it would not trail in the half-frozen mud, and soon spotted movement. The man walking uphill out of the village, very definitely not a local, and my curiosity grew stronger. I set off after him, darting from house to house so as to have some cover if he looked back. How far did I intend to follow him? I cannot tell you. Eventually, I would have had to ask myself that question, but before I reached that point of awareness, something took the decision entirely out of my hands. The village was surrounded by a rocky, cleared area, and downhill there were fields, but the woods began not far up the slope. I had gone far enough into their depths to realize that a neighbor The nightgown and robe would not make a good attire for creeping after a man who obviously knows his way through such terrain, and to feel the chill biting at my sockless ankles. Drusenev was obscured from sight by a screen of trees, and so was most of the light from the sky. I therefore had not the slightest bit of warning before an arm pinned me tight and a hand clamped over my mouth. I let out an immediate scream insofar as I could, muffled as I was. It wasn't yet a cry for help. My thoughts had stopped dead with shock, leaving nothing but pure animal reflexes. The man jerked me close and hissed something unintelligible in my ear. I could not tell if it was Strawny or some other language. It could have been skrilling, for all my brain was capable of comprehending it. I twisted, trying to get free, and now I did try to shout for help, with no particular success. The man snarled wordlessly, a sound of clear threat, and I stopped. We had managed enough noise between the two of us, though, that my quarry heard and turned back. For a moment or two, it took him to reach us. I thought he might prove my savior. As he drew near, unfortunately, my hopes were dashed. He spoke not to me, but to my captor, and my captor answered him in a language that was neither Skrilling or Vestrani. They clearly knew each other, as if they were not happy with each other, and still did not mean either one. Oh, that still did not mean either one was on my side. The dreamlike feeling vanished as if it never had been there at all. I stood rigid in my captor's grip, mind racing in useless little circles, like a mouse trapped under a basket. What would they do to me? Kidnapping, murder, and outrage upon my honor? All of those and worse seemed possible. I had faced a wolf drake and a stooping dragon, but never a human who wished to do me harm. And the one part of my brain that remained detached enough to observe the scene was disgusted at how badly I had handled it. I am grateful to that little corner of my brain, for it shamed me into better effort. I weighed my options and found them sadly wanting. I had nothing of value with which to bribe the men into letting me go. We were far enough from the village that I couldn't be certain anyone would hear me scream. My captors uncovered my mouth long enough for me to try. His grip was strong as a dragon's, and even if I somehow broke free of it, I wouldn't get very far, stumbling through the woods in my nightgown and robe. I found myself wishing quite irrationally that I had read more of Manda Lewis's sensational novels, as if those would provide anything like useful guidance in a situation like this. Perhaps I would have been better off not weighing my options. They both dismayed and distracted me, such that I was taken by surprise when the hand over my mouth vanished, and the man I'd been pursuing stuffed some kind of rag between my teeth. I shouted as loudly as I could, which was not very, and squirmed more, but they soon had me bound, gagged, and blindfolded. Before the kerchief went over my eyes, I caught a glimpse of my captor, who proved to be another light-haired man, taller and more heavily built than the first. Once I was sufficiently trussed up, he threw me over his shoulder, and off we went. So it was to be kidnapping then, at least to begin with, and my blood ran cold at the possible sequel. We soon achieved sufficient distance from the village, or rather they did, and I was carried along willy-nilly, that the men felt it was safe to talk at greater lengths. From the tones, it was clear that my captor knew my bearer. Now my bearer, was seriously displeased with the man who had gone to visit his lover and was reading him quite a lecture. And then, to my surprise, I realized that I was gathering the sense from more than just their tones. I could understand them. Not well, mind you. If my skrilling readers have ever encountered farmer a farmer, from the more distant rural parts of the country, they will have some sense of what I heard that night. Familiar words turned on their heads and decorated with oddly bent vowels. They were not speaking Skrilling, of course, but their language once recognized was easier for me to grasp than Strawny. It was an obscure dialect of Ivers, which I had studied as a girl. There is, of course, a world of difference between learning to sing a song or read a poem in Ivers or any other language, and translating the angry conversation of two strangers while you are slung over the shoulder of one, being carried through the midnight forests of mountainous Strawny. Now that I recognize the language, though, I was able to follow the general thrust of the argument, which I shall take the liberty of recreating. "You're an idiot," my bearer said in disgust, except he used some word I did not know, whose meaning I suspect was rather more opprobrious. "I told you not to go back there." "I didn't think it would do any harm," the young lover protested. I had seen his face while they were trussing me up, and he could not have been much more than a year or two above my age, if that. My bearer snorted and hitched me higher on his shoulder. "You mean you didn't think I would notice? You're lucky I did, or this little chit. That's like a poker chip. Would have followed you all the way back to our camp." "What does that mean?" the lover asked sullenly. "You're bringing her there yourself." So he was, and I did not like to think why that might be. But knowledge was my one tool, and so I kept listening. "I'm not about to let her go running back and raise a cry," my bearer said. "Maybe the locals ignore you going for a tickle with your pretty widow, but this one isn't from around here. I want to know who she is and what she's doing here. Then we'll decide what to do with her." For all that he spoke like a leader of this pair at least, and likely of more, and they hadn't been in the area for long, or they would know of Drustanev's skrilling visitors. I grunted as the pieces fell into place. Yellow hair and a dialect unrecognizable, if only barely, as Ivers. These fellows must be Strahlerans. I could not in that moment remember the details of their history, but an army from Iverheim had marched through these mountains 200 years previously, and some being cut off at war's end with no pay and no way home had settled in the region. Their descendants, known as Stahlerans, lived for the most part on the northern side of the Strawny Mountains, but their young men occasionally crossed south towards Chiavara for one clandestine and lucrative purpose: smuggling. Well, two clandestine purposes, if one counted midnight tickles with pretty widows. But smuggling was of primary importance. Brandy or opium, I wondered. Not that it much mattered, except insofar as it might tell me whether my captors were more likely to be drunk or drugged when they decided what to do with me. Did smugglers sample their own cargo? I had no idea, nor any idea what to do with my understanding, except cling tight to it and wait for a chance. Upside down and blindfolded as I was, I cannot say how long I was carried through the woods. All my blood had rushed to my head, and my bare shoulders digging into my lower abdomen became more painful with each step. Furthermore, my clothing was far from sufficient for the nighttime chill. I have known winter days in Skirland that are warmer than a florist's night in Strawny. Consequently, it came as a complete surprise when my bearer stopped and dumped me without ceremony onto the ground. My first reaction was pure relief that I could relax my abused stomach muscles and breathe freely. All around me was half intelligible speak in Ivers, which I hadn't the wit to attend to, when a hand snatched a kerchief from my head and I could see. Even the small fire burning nearby was too much light at first. I blinked and curled my legs under me, less to hide my bare ankles than to warm them. There were half a dozen men I saw, all Stollerans, each one more villainous looking than the last, if only from lack of bathing. My bearer knelt in front of me, kerchief in hand, and addressed me in Vestrani. "Who are you?" I thought of my shouting match with Dagmira, my deplorable grammar, and judged it better to take my chances with standard Ivers in that tongue. I said, "I'm sorry, I don't speak Vestrani very well. Can you understand me?" His eyebrows went up, and the others muttered in surprise. "You're from Iverheim?" my bearer asked. Judging by the way the others were standing back, letting him question me, he was indeed their leader. I quickly reviewed the formal pronouns in my mind. It is never bad policy to be polite to one's captor. I said, "No, I'm from Skirland, but you and your companions are Stollerans, are you not? I thought we might converse more easily in your language." From what I could gather out of the laughter and muttered jokes between the other men, they thought it grand comedy that I was using formal pronouns for their leader. The man himself grinned. "Squirreling, eh? And what are you doing here in Vestrana?" During the men's interruption, I had taken swift inventory of my present assets. They consisted of one inadequately warm robe, one even more inadequate nightgown, a pair of shoes. I had other belongings back in Drustanev, but we'd brought equipment more than money, and these men would not want to show their faces to negotiate for my ransom. The pine needles, small stones, and dirt within reach, myself. Okay. As I have said before, I am an old woman now and don't much care whom I shock or offend. I will tell you honestly that I thought of the pretty widow in Drustanev, and I thought of myself not particularly pretty, but young and healthy, which goes quite far among men isolated in the mountains, and far from completely attired, and I wondered if I might be able to bargain my charms in exchange for release. Did you not believe me when I wrote earlier of my deranged practicality? Perhaps this will convince you then. We are not supposed to speak of such things, of course, but on that cold night my mind performed an even colder arithmetic. It would be better to comply than to be forced, and compliance might preserve my life in the bargain, if I could bring myself to do it, which was by no means certain. Whether I could or not, such tactics could not be my first resort. I answered the leader's questions honestly. "I'm here to study dragons." By the perplexity of his expression, he thought at first that the differences of language were causing him to misunderstand. I watched him mouth the words as if tasting them for consonants. I might have pronounced wrong. The way Hingis will sometimes say bear when they mean pear. Balur, I added helpfully, trusting him to recognize the Vestrani word. His eyes widened. You mean you're here to hunt them? There were at the time big game hunters who pursued dragons for sport, despite the impossibility of keeping trophies beyond the old tooth or claw. I shook my head. "No, I mean study for science." "You?" he said in disbelief, gesturing at his disheveled and he gestured at my disheveled and female self. He did not use the formal pronoun. "Not alone, no," I said. I said, feeling a twinge of guilt for overstating my role. I am here with companions, a squirreling earl and his assistant, and my husband. I stumbled over the last word, remembering my bleak calculations of the moment before. The leader scratched his head. Your husband, eh? I wondered frantically whether to issue the usual melodramatic threats. If you hurt me, he will hunt you to the ends of the earth, or to attempt to flirt my way free, or to claim it was my unclean time. Stollerans, I thought, followed the temple, even though their brethren back in Iverheim had since become largely magisterial. In the end, my conflicting impulses produced a smile. I cannot describe that smile for you. I have no idea what it looked like to the smuggler. To me, it felt like an incoherent blend of hopelessness and desperation. Whatever its appearance, its effect was to make him burst out laughing. Good woman. Oh, good, good goodness, woman, he said, proving by his blasphemy that if he did follow the temple, he did not do so very well. You bat your eyelashes at me and expect me to believe you're here for science? I am, I said, the confusion of the moment before resolving quite nearly into indignance. The Strawny Rockworms. I came along to do sketches. I'm an artist of sorts. At least I would do sketches if I knew where the dragons were layering and I could get close. But so far, the last word stretched out comically as inspiration ambushed me. You must know, rockworms don't normally attack people, or so Lord Hilford says, despite what happened to us on the way here. But they are territorial and don't like people coming near their lairs. You're smugglers, aren't you? So you must know the mountains very well. Surely you know where the dragons are. Oh, if you tell me how to find them, I'm certain Lord Hilford would pay you handsomely. We've wasted so much time already. By the time I had run out of breath and words, everyone was staring. In my excitement, I had risen up onto my knees, gesticulating with my bound hands like a Chiavoran street seller. There was no chance of my captor doubting me now. I would have to have been a stage actress to feign that kind of demented enthusiasm. What sort of woman, upon being kidnapped by smugglers in the middle of the night, would jump for joy at the thought of questioning them about dragons? He didn't doubt me, but he didn't entirely believe my words either, simply because they made no sense. Why do you care about dragons? We're going to have to stop this here. This time I'm going to remember to put the bookmark in. We still have, we only have 2 pages left in that chapter. So anyways, we have been reading from A Natural History of Dragons, a memoir by Lady Trent, and it is a book by Marie Brennan. If you like this content, then make sure you like and subscribe and ring the bell so you know when I upload. Also, if you want to support me anyway, or join the Discord server, all that information is in the description below. As always, thanks for watching, everyone, and have a great day.